I'm WUSA 9 Chief Investigative Reporter Eric Flack with Digital Investigative Reporter Jordan Fisher, standing outside the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., where it is a historic day to say the least. Former President Donald Trump charged with 4 federal crimes in relation to the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol, which stands just a stone's throw from where we are now. Jordan, let's start at the beginning. Let's go through those charges one by one. What are they?
Sure, Eric, important to remember we're still going through the indictment. It's a 45-page indictment, but those charges here right off the bat, let's read through them. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. And worth noting, 2 of those charges are very similar to the charges, in fact, the exact same charges that more than 300 Capitol riot defendants have already faced and federal court right behind us.
And those obstruction charges have the potential to carry serious jail time.
Absolutely. They are 20-year max felonies. They've resulted in sentences of years and years in prison. In fact, today, the defendant who you may recognize, Richard Barnett, who was photographed with his feet up in the Speaker's lobby, who was convicted of obstruction of an official proceeding, began his 4-year prison sentence today. So, even without assault charges to back it up, that alone can carry a very substantial prison time.
Why is that charge so serious in the eyes of the law? The obstructing of official proceeding, and let's talk about what the proceeding was that they are specifically accused of trying to obstruct.
So the statute comes from a post-Enron scramble by Congress to cover up what they saw as a loophole that allowed Enron's accounting firm to reverse their conviction. And the importance is that the point is that you have taken some substantial step to obstruct either a court proceeding or a significant congressional proceeding, in this case the joint session of Congress. And why January 6th is so significant, and why the Department of Justice has said this time and time again, is that it is not just a meeting of Congress. It is a constitutionally mandated date. It has to happen on January 6th, every 4 years, in which Congress, the 2 houses of Congress, join together and they certify the election. It's not like even a court hearing or anything like that. The Constitution itself mandates what has to happen that day.
One charge that was not in there that people have heard a lot about is seditious conspiracy. Oath Keepers leaders have been charged with that. I believe Proud Boys leaders have also been charged with that. Why was Donald Trump not charged with seditious conspiracy?
It's a good question. It wasn't surprising to me, Eric. If you followed any of our reporting in either of those 2 previous trials, you may recall I spoke over and over again about this unique requirement that defendants forcibly conspire against the government. That's in the seditious conspiracy statute. You have to show that they forcibly conspired to essentially stop a law from going into effect or to overthrow the government. In the Oath Keepers case, prosecutors were able to convince a jury that the pile of weapons that they had hoarded outside of D.C. in a hotel amounted to that. In the Proud Boys case, there was evidence that they had brought along people who pushed past barricades, who assaulted police, things like that. I think in this case it would have been much harder to show that the former president reached an agreement with anyone to use force. And in fact, we see that in the indictment. The Justice Department seems to have taken pains to avoid suggesting or implying that the former president incited the violence. In fact, what they say specifically in the indictment is that he exploited the violence, which is to say that the violence happened, albeit, they say, because of lies that he told the public, and then he took advantage of that.
And so now we kind of start looking at the trial phase and what an incredibly unreal sight that's going to be. The judge who has been assigned to this case is particularly important. You have been down covering this for 2.5 years. You've sat in that judge's chambers. You have followed trials that she has ruled on. Why is this judge so critical in this particular case of the former president?
All right, so the judge has been randomly assigned. It's Judge Tanya S. Chutkan. She was nominated to the federal bench in 2013 by former President Barack Obama. She did her undergraduate here at George Washington University. Some of her previous cases include the Maria Butina Russian spy case, but notably here in January 6th cases, what we've seen from her is a willingness to go above sentences that the Justice Department has asked for. In fact, back in December 2021, in one of the earliest sentences, she varied upward. Granted, it was only a 20-day sentence, but still at the time, it was very unusual and remains very unusual. And what she said as her reasoning for going above the DOJ's sentence was that the country is watching, stressing the importance of these cases at the time. And still 2.5 years later, she's one of the very few judges that has gone above what the DOJ has asked in any of these sentencing hearings.
Well, and again, important to note and double punch on the fact that that was a random assignment. There's obviously going to be talk about political motivation. The former president is already talking about the Department of Justice being weaponized.
Sure.
Key to point out that judge was randomly assigned to this case.
It is random. There's a lot that goes into it, as the number of cases already on the judge's docket, things like that. But I think, as you see in Florida, where the Justice Department charged this case and received Judge Eileen Cannon, who was appointed by the former president himself, they charged their case here and they received a different judge. They had a chance of getting any of the 4 judges that former President Trump had appointed to the D.C. District Court, just as good a chance of getting any of those. And in fact, hundreds of January 6 cases have gone to those judges. It's really just a roll of the dice.
Got some protesters passing by us right now. We did talk a lot about, the charges themselves and what is going to happen moving forward. When you look at a potential trial, you've been down here for 2.5 years. What does a trial with the former president even look like? If it makes it to trial, will he have to appear in court for any of the proceedings before a trial?
Right. He absolutely will have to appear in court. In fact, part of what the DOJ asked for today was a summons, which means he'll have to show up in person for his initial appearance. Now, right off the bat, expect that the former president and his attorneys are going to ask for what's known as a change of venue, which is, in short, to move this trial out of D.C. They're going to argue that the extensive publicity that this case has received over the last 2.5 years warrants it. They're going to argue that, as many January 6 defendants have, that the D.C. potential jury pool here is inherently biased against him. And in fact, the Federal Public Defender's Office here has conducted a poll that they argue shows that, and as a matter of fact. Now, change of venues rarely happen in federal court.
Have they happened so
Not
far?
a single January 6 case has been moved out of the district, and we're talking about more than 1,000 that have been charged now, and hundreds that have reached resolution. Part of that is because there's a clause in the Constitution that says that a case should be tried in the jurisdiction where the crime occurred, or the alleged crime occurred, rather. As far as what a trial would look like with the former president, we really have no idea. It's an unprecedented situation. I can tell you that there has been enhanced security at the courthouse that reporters here have noticed for weeks. That's likely to continue. I think you're certainly likely to see much stricter rules on who could be in the courtroom. Obviously, many reporters from outlets all around the world are going to want to be part of this. But in reality, we're very far away from any inevitable trial date. You understand that, cases that were charged, in some cases in the immediate weeks or months after January 6th, still have not gone to trial yet. So we could be talking about years before this case potentially sees a jury.
And we're talking about a presidential election that Donald Trump is very much a part of, still going on, and likely will conclude before any potential trial even happens. I do want to know why it is so significant that these charges were brought in Washington, D.C. You will remember that the Mar-a-Lago case, the concealing of the classified documents, the conspiracy there to kind of hide them from investigators, was charged in a Florida court. Sure. But these charges are coming right here in Washington, D.C.
Right, well, like I said earlier, there's a clause in the Constitution that says those charges have to be filed in the jurisdiction where the alleged crime was committed. And in fact, we've seen in at least one January 6th case I can think of, charges dropped because the DOJ charged in D.C. and what their defense attorney argued and what the judge found was that the alleged crime had actually occurred in Virginia. And so the reason it's charged here is because they believe this is where the alleged crime occurred. Now, one thing to note in the indictment is that there are 6 unnamed co-conspirators. None of them have been charged, or at least no charge.
Do we know who they are?
We have some idea of who they are. They have descriptions. There are 5 attorneys, including one who was an official in the Justice Department at the time, and then a political consultant who helped develop the strategy to submit these false slates of electors. None of them are named. I don't want to speculate, but if any of them are ultimately charged, now they could potentially argue that they would be more appropriately charged in a different jurisdiction because they were in a different state at the time when the alleged agreement occurred. So we may conceivably see prosecutions in multiple states.
What's next?
What's next is that the former president will have to make his appearance here. He will have to find local counsel to represent him, just like he did in Florida. It's unclear whether he will share legal teams or he will try to find a new team here in D.C. I think there's certainly more to be seen about these co-conspirators, as we've seen in that Mar-a-Lago case. Just last week they superseded that indictment and added a new co-conspirator, so it seems very likely here that we could see the same, and we could see additional names added to this indictment and additional charges filed.
You spent 2.5 years of your life at this courthouse. Are you ready to spend another 2.5 years down here? Because it sounds like that's what we're looking at.
I'm a huge fan of the cafeteria food here now. I know exactly what I get every day. This is the story of the day, right? This is the story that we are here to cover. You and I have been covering January 6th since it happened together, and of course I've spent, as you said, a lot of time here, and it seems like that's not going to change anytime soon. And
whether you're on one side or another, there is no doubt that this is history that's happening right before our eyes right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it's a historic precedent. It's only the second time in history a former president has ever been indicted. It's obviously the stakes of suggesting that a former president had conspired to overturn a lawfully conducted election are enormous for our country's history, for democracy, for how the world perceives us. So I think it's a case that we're going to be watching very closely.
Digital investigative reporter Jordan Fisher will be watching closely, as WUSA 9 will as well. Thanks for listening in.